What exactly are CSS modules? Before I explain what they are, let's take a look at plain old CSS. When you work with CSS, you have one or many style sheets and they live pretty much on their own. And that's fine for simple apps or websites. But when your application or website grows, most likely you'll need to start splitting your components into smaller chunks to make it more manageable. Yet your CSS, even with leveraging imports, can become harder to manage, especially if you add scripts into your CSS. CSS modules comes to the rescue and facilitates this growth by first doing a one-to-one relationship where each component has its own CSS, but also integrates tightly into React's component approach with the possibility of using JavaScript or any methods available to React. This allows you to do really dynamic CSS and easily manage the component styles when needed. And all of this will be demonstrated as we add the modules into our application. So let me demonstrate an overview of how our website will be built and how CSS modules will impact this. We'll first have a background with its own background CSS, so a component to CSS one-to-one relationship. Then we'll have a title, same way. And then we'll have a big grid, which will also have its own module or modular CSS. And then each grid item, because it's its own component, will have its own CSS. But remember, like in React, because we're repeating the same component across, we only need to create a component and therefore its modular CSS once. And finally, we'll have the rocket and the smoke component and therefore its own CSS. Okay, so now that we have a good understanding of the benefits and how we are going to build a website, let's move on. Now that we understand how we're going to build our website, let's go ahead and structure a project and add the proper files. Also, in the exercise files, there are two files that are called React Stateful and React Stateless. So if you look into the resources, you have those two files. And these are templates that you can use to add the proper code inside of our initial components. So if you want to use the stateless one, you can use this one, which is basically a functional component. And this one is a full stateful component. So if you want to use one or the other, you can leverage those to make your initial components as we create the new components inside of our application. So what I'm going to do is basically open those two inside of its own Visual Studio Code. So what I'm going to do is right-click to Visual Studio Code, create a new window, and then inside of that window, I'm going to basically add those two files like so. So if I need anything, and let me just close this. So if I need any code here, I have these two that I can leverage for the components that we're going to create. So let me get back to our project right here. And the first thing I'm going to do is create inside of our source file a few files here and a few folders. So let's go ahead and inside of the source folder, create a new folder. And I'm going to call this one background. And then let's go again in the source folder, and I'm going to create the grid. And by the way, if you want to insert them inside of a component folder, so you can basically have less stuff inside of the source folder, feel free to do so. It's either way works as long as you have your imports named properly. Otherwise, just follow along what I'm doing. Next one is called Rocket. And the final one is called title. Okay, so now we have all of our files here, plus the 3 folders that we need for future stuff. So inside of background, I'm going to start creating new files. So the first one is going to be the module for the CSS. So we're going to call this background.module.css, like so. Then again, inside of that folder, I'm going to create the component. So background.js. And again, if you want to copy from our own Visual Studio files that I just loaded, you can simply copy and paste from these two samples or templates. So for this one, I'm going to use the stateful. So I'll copy, paste, and then save. And then we have the background done. So in the grid, let's go ahead and create new files as well. So I'm just going to maximize this. I'm going to create 4 files for the grid. The main grid, as you remember, we had our main grid. And then inside of that grid, we had the single components that are repeated, so on and so forth. So that needs also a component. So we need to create 4 files. So the first one is going to be, again, grid.module.css. And then we're going to create a second file, which is going to be the grid.js. And then another file, which will be the grid item. So grid item.module.css. And then finally, grid item.js for the actual file. Perfect. And let me just close a few of those. I need to keep the grid.js and the grid item.js so I can copy and paste. I already copied it, so I'm assuming I can paste again. Yep. So I'm going to do all of these as stateful for now, just save them, and then change as we need the stateless. Again, those files are already at my disposal whenever I need them. So just going to minimize this, maximize this, and then paste again. Save, and as I complete them, I'm just going to close them. Okay, so now we can close this folder, and now we're going to create the title, and actually those two shouldn't be together like that, so let me delete that. And now I have just Rocket. Perfect. And now in the source file, I need to create a new folder called title. Perfect. So you need to have those 4 separate. I didn't want to have indented folders inside of folders. So that's perfect. Okay, so now let's go back to Rocket, and we're going to create 4 files inside of Rocket. The smoke, so the module for smoke, the component, and the same thing for Rocket. So let's go ahead and create those. I'm going to start with the rocket.module.css, then create the actual component, so rocket.js. Then let's go and do the same for the smoke, so smoke.module.css. And now let's create also the component, so smoke.js. And before we move on to the title, let's make sure we have some code inside of our 2 components. So I'm going to close the CSS ones. And let's make sure that I have something copied, stateful again, and then let's just paste our smoke.js component. Save that, and then do it again, save that, and now we're done with the Rocket stuff and the smoke. Now in the title, we need 2 things. So we need the title.module.css, and finally we need the module component. Sorry, we need the title component. Perfect. So now what we need to do is paste also the stateful component right here. And now we have all of our files ready for the next step. So if we want to take a look at what we've created, we have our background, which has the module, so the CSS module, and the component. We have the grid, which we have the overall grid with its own module and the component, and the grid item, which will be repeated inside of the grid with its own module CSS. Same thing for the rocket and the smoke, so the module and the component for both. And then finally the title, which has its own component and also the CSS module. So now we have our full structure for our project completed and ready to go for us to work on it. So let's move on. So now let's continue setting up our application. So what we're going to do in this particular video, we're going to add a title for each of our components with an h1, and then we're going to add all these components inside of our main app.js component. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to open first the background like so. And basically all I'm going to do instead of stateful component, I'm going to change this to the actual component. In this case, it's the background. So let's go ahead and do that and make sure that this is typed properly, and then save this, and then repeat the same process for each of our components. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video and practice on your own, feel free to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to basically go through each of the components and change the h1 title. And that's how simple this is going to get. So this one is the grid. This one is the grid item. Then I'm going to continue with rocket, like so. Rocket, save it, do smoke. And basically the reason why I'm doing this is because when we load them inside of our application, we're going to know what is what. So basically once we attach all of these components inside of the main app.js component, we're going to see smoke, we're going to see grid item, and so on and so forth. So we're going to be able to position them properly inside of the main component. And I typically do that when I build an application, and just to structure the application properly, I add all these titles, and then when I connect them inside of the main component, I know where each of the components sits. All right, so we're going to do the same for title, and then save. And then we're going to go inside of the main component, so the app.js, and we're going to import each of these components first. So we're going to import title from, and then title, and then / title, like so. And just a little tip, if you want to have the proper component suggested to you, what you can do is do from first. So where you want to load from, and in this case, we're going to load background next. And then based on what you've imported, it's going to suggest to you what components are available. Like so. But I typically do everything in order. So it's a little trick from Visual Studio Code if you want to try it. Whenever you have like large libraries, you're not so sure what's available, you can load the from first, load the library first, and then import, and then it's going to suggest as you type things. But now I prefer doing the from after because it's actually suggesting what's available to me when I start typing in. So grid, so let's go ahead and do that, and then grid, import rocket. And the reason why I'm not importing grid item, it's because it's going to be inside of the grid. And then finally, smoke. From the rocket folder, like so. Okay, so now we have all our imports. And now what we could do is start putting them inside of our component. So I'm going to start with title, because that's the first one I want. Then I'm going to do background. Then I'm going to do grid, rocket, and you can probably guess what's going to happen for next two. And finally, smoke, like so. And just to be structurally sound, you want to indent them inside of the main div, like so. Awesome. So now all you have to do is save this, and we have our first structure in place, so we can start working with CSS modules. Let's move on. CSS modules allows us to scope our CSS inside of a specific component, like we demonstrated earlier. and also make it reusable across different projects. So for example, if you create a component and its corresponding styles with CSS modules, you can literally copy the folder of that specific component into another project, and you'll maintain all of its styles without having to go through several CSS files to find them. So let's go ahead and work on our first CSS module, and then I'll show you how you could copy these styles or this module into another project and reuse it. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to clean up my work area and just leave title and clean the other one like so. And then open up the title module CSS, this file. So the first thing we're going to do is actually create the styles inside of our CSS module here. So what I'm going to do is create a class called title. And then inside of that class, I'm going to start with font family, use Roboto, or sans serif if Roboto is not available on the browser or not supported on the browser. And then we'll do a font size of 4EM. Now you can save this. And now let's load this module inside of our component right here. So the first thing we're going to do, like we've done before, and this is good practice, is start to import the module. So we're going to import styles from our module. So the file is title.module.css, like so. And then what we can do is apply those styles to that specific component. And while we're at it, let's change that component to a functional component, because right now it's a class component and it's not really required because we're simply loading a title. We're not passing anything from the state, from a state that's loaded here, so we don't need the class. So as you remember, I had a couple of examples here. So I have the stateless and the stateful component already for you if you wanted to leverage it, and we're going to do that. So what I'm going to do is simply copy this particular area like so, quickly paste it here like so, and we're going to change this to title. We're not importing any props, so that's not required. And then here we're going to change it to title. So we can copy that line if we want to, or simply type it here like so. And then we're going to pass the styles to the title. So let's go ahead and do that. So class name. And by the way, if you don't know why we're using class name as opposed to class in pure HTML, it's because the work class is already used in React. And pass styles dot title like so, because we're loading styles here from the title module, and we want to make sure we have the same name here, so we should be fine. And then we need to correct this by simply doing this like so, and obviously remove our class or stateful component. All right, so now we're good. Let's save this and let's start our application. So I'm going to click on terminal, new terminal, do npm start just to see if there's any issues that we need to take care of. And something is wrong here. Title does not contain a default export imported as title. And that's definitely something we need to work on. So let's go ahead and do export default title. And that's my bad. I forgot to do the export, which is something that I typically do directly in the class component here, and I forgot to add it here. So let's save that. And now we have our application running, and let's check the application. And as structured in the previous video, we have all of our other components inside of our main app component, like so. Awesome. So what if you wanted to basically copy all this into a new application? All you would have to do is create a brand new React application and copy the folders right here inside of the source folder directly into your application, and then make sure that there's no errors from loading the app here. So index.js is importing app from the right directory, and then do the same from app to the others. And that's basically what you would need to check and make sure that you're importing properly inside of your application. And automatically the styles from the module would be applied to your component here and show up on the page. So as you can see, CSS modules allow complete flexibility and reusability of the CSS for your components. There might be cases where you need to leverage styles from other style sheets or classes. And this is where Compose comes into play. So let me demonstrate. So the first thing we're going to do is actually grab some pictures from the exercise files. So let me minimize all this. And I'm going to open my project right here and open the exercise files and go into the resources. And the files that you want is the alpha, nebula, and then stars. So I'm going to select this, this, and this, and then copy. And then I'm going to go into the source folder. We used to put the images in the public folder, but recent development with React basically disallows us to put this into the public folder and then actually tag them or use them inside of our code here. So you need to create the images folder inside of the source folder like so. So new folder, let's call this one images. And then I'm going to paste the 3 images that I just copied. So now we're all set. And let's go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code. So the 2 files that I want to work on is the background.js. So we're going to be working on the background and the background module CSS. So those are the 2 files. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some styles to the background. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing, I'm going to create a new class called background items. And this is going to be a class that will leverage across other classes. And I'll use Compose after that to leverage that class. So let's go ahead and start typing some stuff. So position, we're going to have it fixed. And then top, we're going to have 0. Left, 0. We're going to do right, 0. Bottom, the same thing. Width, we're going to be at 100%. Height, the exact same thing. And then finally, we want to display this as a block, like so. So now that we have our main class, we'll start generating the class for the stars, the alpha, and the nebula, and we'll use Compose to leverage the class background items. So I'm going to show you how that works. So let's go ahead and start with stars. And we're going to use composes and then type background items like so. So what happens here? Because we've actually defined all these styles for background items, when we use composes and actually add background items as the class that we're leveraging, we don't have to redo all that code again for stars. We're basically combining the class background items with the actual styles that we'll define for stars. So what we're going to do now, we're going to do a background, which will be black, and we'll have a URL, which will include the image that we just imported inside of our project. So let's go ahead and grab that image. So you're going to have to do twice getting out of there and then go into, actually not twice, but just once. Sorry about that. And then go into images and then select stars. And then we want to repeat top, center. So now we've defined the background for that specific class. Now we'll use the Z index to position it front to back inside of our composition that we're doing for this particular application. So this is going to be the further out image that we're going to leverage because the other two are going to be front to the stars class. So let's go ahead and create the alpha class now. Let's go and create that. So for the alpha class, we're going to do compose again, background and z-index. So let's copy those styles here and paste them here like so. So we're still composing background items. So we're leveraging some of that. The background is not going to be black. It's going to be transparent. The URL this time is going to leverage the alpha image. And again, we're doing repeat top center. Now for the alpha, the z-index is going to be -2. So this one is going to be on top of the stars. So the minus determines where it is positioned in the z coordinates. So basically the way to determine where it sits in the z-index is the higher the number, the better it is, or in front of everything else. So if you want to have something in front of the alpha, you would put 0, 1, or above. And finally, for this one, we're going to add animation, which will actually write momentarily. And basically, the animation that we'll leverage is called stargazing. And we're going to do 500 seconds, linear animation, and infinite. So basically, we'll always play. Then we're going to paste again what we just did and actually create the class first. So this is going to be Nebula, again, for the last image. Paste what we've already written. And for the background, it's going to be transparent as well. Transparent. The URL this time is going to be Nebula. Repeat top center as well. And the z-index is going to be -1 because this is going to be on top of the alpha and the stars. And finally, I want to add some opacity for that one. So let's go ahead and do that. And the opacity will be at 0.15. So although nebulas are going to be there, it's going to be very, very opaque or not as apparent as the other images. And finally, let's do the animation. So let's do keyframes. And let's make sure we use the name properly. Stargazing, that's the one we have here. Perfect. And the animation is going to be from background. So basically what we're doing here is doing an animation from 0.0 to, and again, we're leveraging background position like so, minus 10,000 pixels, 5,000 pixels. So basically what we've done here is an animation of that particular image, which is the alpha. So this alpha image is going to be moving from these positions every 500 seconds in a linear animation, and it's going to be infinite. Okay, so now that we've defined all of our styles here, let's go into our JavaScript file and make sure first we import it. So import styles from background.module, and you want to make sure again that you're naming it the same way. So module.css, like so. And then inside of our component, we're going to start leveraging those styles. So we'll have the first div with a class name and the styles stars, like so. And then let's copy that line. We're going to paste it twice after that to do the other two images. So basically, we're going to do alpha next. And then finally, nebula. Like so. Okay, perfect. So now that we have the component done, we have all of our styles. Let's take a look at what it looks like. So we have something in error here. So I made a little typo. Let's go and correct that. Small error. Let me bring up the terminal, and the terminal says that we have no errors now, so we're all good. Let's go back to our browser, and we have our stars. So basically the animation, I don't know if you can see it, but right now there's something that's moving that makes all these dots go out or in, and that's the animation that makes some type of stargazing or sky with stars that are coming in and out. And this is, in my opinion, very beautiful and ready to move on for the next stage of our project. So like I said, Compose is another tool that allows you to leverage styles from other files or within the same file. So let's move on. Okay, so let's move on to code our grid component. We'll also set up our state so we can start using it for data, UI, and animations. So let's get to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually leverage some data that I created for you in the resources. So if you click on the exercise files, resources, you have a JSON file right here that's called nasa._facts. And what I want to do is copy that and close it. And then inside of our CSS modules in the source folder, I'm going to create a data folder. And I'm going to paste that file inside of that folder, like so. Perfect. Now we're ready to get back to our code. And I'm going to remove my terminal for now. And I'm using basically a shortcut, which is Control Grave. And then let's close the backgrounds. And what I want to do is open first the app.js file. So that's the first one I want to do. So what we're going to do first is import the data inside of that file. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to write a little comment here, data, and then import facts from, go into the data folder right here. And that's what I want. Perfect. So now that we have that, we have a little problem inside of our app.js file. We have a functional component and not a class or stateful component. So what we're going to do is basically redo that component above right here. So I'm going to do a class app extends component. And then the first thing I'm going to do inside of that class is add the constructor. So I can pass props to it. Super props. And this is the template for most of your stateful components. So if you're familiar with React, you're familiar with this. So I'm going to create a state and I'm going to pass facts to it. And that's pretty much it. I don't need that much more. I don't want to spend too much time on the state. It's just typical code. So I can actually render a component with data inside of it. So let's go ahead and create the render function. And inside of the render function, all I need is the return. So what I could do is copy my return right here, cut it, and paste it inside of my render right here, like so. And then I can remove this thing here. So now that I have all this in here, what I need to do next, and if you want to test that your code is working fine, you can save it, bring back the terminal, making sure that something is working properly. If it's not, then make the proper change. In this case, component is not defined. So we really need to go to here and make sure that we also import React. Component like so from React, and we should be fine with the error. So now we're back. I'm going to remove my terminal by doing Control Grave or just clicking the X. But now what I need to do is pass the state to our grid. So we need to pass it to the grid so we can actually create the grid item and repeat the grid item how many times we have elements inside of our data. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to pass the facts and do this dot state dot facts. Okay, so now this is done. Let's save that. And now let's go into our grid right here. And our grid, we're going to start leveraging some of the stuff that we've actually pass to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is first make sure that I can import grid item in here. So let's go ahead and import grid item from grid item like so. So now we have that component. Let's also import the styles, which will actually change later on. So let's import the styles from our grid.module.css. And you want to make sure that you don't make any typos because React is going to tell you. And then in here, before my actual render, I'm going to create a function that will basically repeat the grid item with the number of elements that I have in my data. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create this render facts function in here, and it's going to return this .props.facts. So the props that I passed to this component, and then we'll map it in for how many items I have inside of the data. Please render what follows. And this is where we're going to render our grid item. So the grid item is going to have inside of it a key, which will be the ID of the item. Let's take a look at the data just to make sure you understand what's happening here. So let's go back to our source, take a look at the data very quickly. And for each elements, and I believe we have 12 elements. Yeah, we have 12 items inside of that JSON file. So for each element, we have an ID, which will be the key for a grid item in here. So the key that I was just about to write. And then for each of these elements, we'll have a title, fact, and click. And this will be passed to that grid item. And then we'll define how that component displays those items in a future video. So let's go ahead and pass the key as item.id. So we have an ID for each item in here. So 0, 1, 2, and whatever follows. And then we're going to pass for each element in our database the item. So whatever is in the item here will have access to all that data and leverage it inside of the component. So then we need to make sure we close that component, and then that completes what we need to do in here. And we'll actually leverage the styles later on, but I'm not going to do that on that video. So what we've done now is actually pass data to our application and then leverage that data inside of our grid, where each of the item in the database will create a new grid item. So let's save that and make sure we don't have any problems. Yeah, so we have a warning, which is fine because we've defined styles, but we haven't used it, so that's fine. If we ended up not using the styles, I would remove it. So let's take a look also at our application, and we're still running fine. Good. So now we're done with this. Let's move on. Okay, so let's finish our grid items and make sure that we have styles applied to the grid and the grid items as well. So we have a lot of code to write in this video. So let's get ready. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually go to the grid and add some styles that we can apply to the grid. So let's go ahead and create a class called grid. And we're going to call or use columns gap or column gap. And we're going to do 10 pixels, column count. We're going to do 3. And then padding, we're going to do 175 px to 20 px or pixels, 10 pixels, and 20 pixels. And by the way, all these values are values that I actually tested before I did the course. So if you wonder what these are, or if you want to play with them, go ahead and actually change those and you'll see the results directly on the page. But these are the things that I actually worked with and basically set for my own project here. All right, so let's save that. We can close the file and then let's go in the actual grid and load that CSS in here. So we already did the import, so we're good there. What we need to do at this point is actually use the render facts function inside of our render here because it's not rendering it anyways right now, and actually leverage the styles as well. So let's finish that code here. It will be very simple. So the first thing we're going to do is do a section with a class name, and then we'll apply the styles.grid, what we just written, and then close that. And then inside of that section, we're going to render this.render facts. Boom. And we're done. So let's save. Let's check with our terminal. Everything is working fine, so we're still good. And now let's move on to the actual grid item. And what I'm going to do for this one is do the actual CSS first and then apply the CSS to the actual component. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to open the grid item CSS and the grid item component, the JavaScript, so grid item.js. So let's go into our module CSS and let's start writing some CSS. So the first thing we're going to create is a card class, and inside of it, we're going to do display inline block, and then we're going to do a width of 90%. And again, these values are all stuff that I've defined before. So if you want to play with these, go ahead and change them, and you'll see how it looks versus what I've done. So for that, we're going to do space mono. And again, if it's not available or not supported, we're going to leverage monospace. Border default, border radius. I don't know why I said default. 3px or pixels, border. And we're going to do 1 pixel, solid. And the RGBA value is going to be 168 by 168 by 168. And the alpha is going to be 0.2, like so. Background color. I don't like when it's not suggesting something. That means that I'm not typing something properly. But let's see what happens. RGBA 0, 0, 0, 0.3. Something's off here. Ah, I didn't put the... There you go. That's why. When something's weird, there's a reason. That means you've forgotten something, you've written a typo somewhere, something's off. Just take a look at your code and figure it out. Or take a look at the suggestions from the console. There you go. And then finally, margin button 10 pixel. Okay, so this class is done. Now what we're going to do is a hover for that class. So card.hover. So when we hover over that card, the styles are going to change. So we're going to do animation name flash, and we're going to create that animation shortly. Animation duration 1 second, border. And one of the things that I recommend when people don't want to take a look at me typing all these values, what you could do is basically take a look at the exercise files and reproduce that, because this is basically all code that I've preset before the course because I know these values are going to work. But if you want to play with them, you can play with them. But just to write them, you can actually use the exercise files if you want to. RGBA, and basically we're reusing a lot of the same values as we've used before, which is good. Now we're going to do a title with a margin top of 5 pixels, and then a margin bottom of 10 pixels, like so. And then finally, we're going to do fact, a fact class with a text align of justify. Okay, so that's a lot of CSS, but we're done. Hit return, save, and now let's move on to the actual component. And this is going to be the shorter part. So instead of doing a class component or a stateful component here, let's do a functional component instead. And I'm going to basically do this fairly quickly. So grid item. And don't forget to export after that because I'm basically exporting right here. So let's make sure we export after that. So we're passing props on this one from the grid component. And now let's return and start doing our divs. And what I'm going to do is, well, actually, I don't have to. So let's go and create a div with a class name of styles. And we haven't imported our style yet. So let's go ahead and do that just to make sure that we can leverage the autocomplete because we've already defined it prior. And it's going to be grid item.module.css, like we've done throughout this course. This guy here, or basically this guy. Perfect. So now we can leverage it right here. Styles dot, and this one is the card. Boom. And then we can start working on our H2, our title, with a class name. And again, we defined already a style for our title. And for this guy, the title is going to be passing props dot fact dot title. And again, if you wonder what I'm doing, let's go to the data and we're passing this guy. So we have the ID, title, fact, clicked that we have available for each item inside of that component. So let's leverage the title first, like so. Then the second one is going to be an article tag. And we're going to pass the styles dot, and you probably imagine what I'm going to do next, fact. And now let's close the tag and then pass from the props dot fact dot fact, because we have a fact here that we need to pass inside of the article here. Perfect. So now that we're done, all we need to do is make sure we export our little functional component that we created. And I'm basically just going to leverage what I have in here and just finish it up like so. Boom. Now let's save. I'm going to check my terminal just to make sure that everything is going fine and everything is good there. And then I'm going to switch to the browser just to take a look. Okay, so now we're back in the browser, and obviously there's an issue because right now, if I look at this, I have the text, but because it's black, we can't see it. So we're going to make a minor correction. So let's go back to VS Code. I'm going to hide the terminal, and then I'm going to go into the CSS module. And the only thing I'm going to add is color for the font. So I'm just going to do that below the font family, and I'm going to do color and then simply do white like so. So I'm going to save and then go back to the browser and everything is showing up now. Okay, perfect. So basically what we've built here are the CSS for these cards here. And as you can see, we see the cards, we see all the animations of the stars in the back. This is really cool. So let's move on.